Okay, week 3 of Psych 31, Introduction to Abnormal Psychology. You'll note that in this week, we're combining two chapters of the text. Chapter 3, Models of Abnormal Psychology, and Chapter 4, Assessment, Diagnosis, and Treatment. Chapter 3 of our text examines the range of perspectives or models that help scientists explain and interpret behavioral observations. Today, there are several models used to understand and treat abnormal functioning. And you'll note in the reading that the leading models vary and none of them have proved to be superior over another. They're all like just different lenses to look at behavior from different perspectives, and probably a combination of them is the most accurate. In a second, I'll be giving you a quick overview of Chapter 3, Models, just to move this along since this week we're combining two chapters. Still read the chapter though. There's a lot more in there than I can cover in 10 minutes. Great chapter. And if you haven't noticed by now, the first 3 chapters of the text are helping you to build the foundation to really understand the different diagnoses and mental disorders we'll be talking about later on. And then chapter 4 details the different types of assessments, the DSM-5 for diagnosis, and then lastly looks at the process of treatment. Okay. We're going to look at 5 models of abnormality. These models or paradigms are unique to themselves. They build on other models, and they all spell out basic theories and assumptions of behavior, and they set guidelines for research investigation. But they also provide a framework for practitioners to use when they're seeing clients in therapy, once they're considered evidence-based. Start with the biological model, which is a medical perspective, pretty much. And the main focus is that psychological abnormality is really an illness brought about by the malfunctioning parts of the organism. That's what the book says. It's true, but they typically point to problems in brain anatomy or brain chemistry resulting in aberrant behavior. So biological therapists explain abnormal behavior in that they've discovered connections between certain psychological disorders and problems in specific brain areas. And a lot of focus on neurotransmitters, brain chemicals. Examples of neurotransmitters are serotonin, dopamine, and endorphins. And there's a host, probably close to 100 different neurotransmitters, managing physiology, behaviors, cognition, etc., etc. Studies indicate that abnormal behavior in certain neurotransmitters can lead to specific mental disorders. So a neurotransmitter or neurotransmitters in a certain part of the brain, if they're in excess, will throw the behavioral balance off into abnormality. And the reverse is true. Certain other neurotransmitters in different parts of the brain, when they're just not available enough, will cause imbalances and a resultant abnormality in behavior. So, for an example, depression is linked with low activity in serotonin and norepinephrine neurotransmitters, whereas psychotic behavior is associated with an excess of neurotransmitter dopamine. And so if the abnormal behaviors are a result of biochemical imbalances, then you can begin to understand why biological treatments are using pharmacotherapy or medicines to help stabilize the brain chemistry in order to help stabilize the behavior. There's 4 major groups in psych meds: anti-anxiety drugs, antidepressants, mood stabilizers, and antipsychotics. The second paradigm, second model, psychodynamic, developed by the father of psychodynamic therapy, Sigmund Freud. And it's based on the belief that a person's behavior, whether normal or abnormal, is determined largely by an underlying dynamic, that is, interacting psychological forces of which the person's not consciously aware of. And abnormal symptoms are viewed as the result of a conflict among these forces. What forces? Well, psychodynamic theory would say there's 3 unconscious forces you're not consciously aware of, but they're very active and very influential on how your personality displays itself. There's the id, guided by the pleasure principle. I want it now, to hell with the consequences. There's the ego, trying to balance the impulsivity of the id and the overly prohibitionistic morality principle of the superego. Ego is guided by the reality principle. Superego is guided by the morality principle. And so these three parts of the personality, id, ego, and superego, are often in some degree of conflict with each other. And accordingly, a healthy personality is one in which an effective working relationship exists among the three forces. If, however, the id, ego, and superego are in excessive conflict, the person's behavior can show signs of dysfunction. Defense mechanisms, the only thing I wanted to show you here, please be sure and study these in your text. They're fascinating. Defense mechanisms, I want to say, are neither good nor bad. They just are. They're a part of the human experience. There's always some degree of conflict with the three forces unconsciously. And people generally and naturally use defense mechanisms to try and cope and maintain balance. That's how the ego maintains balance with the pressures from the id and the superego accordingly. It's only when there's an over-reliance of the defense mechanism to try and find a balance by the ego that it becomes exhausted, and there may be some abnormal symptoms starting to appear, and the quality of life starts to get really bad. And so maybe counseling, therapy, and so forth might be in order. The third paradigm model is the behavioral model. And the base explanations and treatments for this model are on the principles of learning. So behavioral theorists believe that our actions are determined largely by our experiences in life, and it looks wholly at behaviors and environmental factors. And here's a behavioral therapy example in teaching children to learn new behaviors. So behavioral therapists would teach parents how to use positive reinforcement appropriately, how to do timeout, response cost, which is withholding rewards or privileges because of unwanted behavior, and to set up token economies where you're combining rewards and consequences so the child earns rewards and privileges when performing desired behaviors, and they lose the rewards and privileges as a result of unwanted behavior. Very typical behavioral therapy based in learning. And the behavioral model really began in laboratories where conditioning studies were conducted. All demonstrate the learning of new behaviors, normal or abnormal, was by association. And there's this illustration showing you that there's three major types of behavioral learning. Classical conditioning, which is Pavlovian, the dogs and the food and the bells. Operant conditioning and observational or vicarious learning. So Ivan Pavlov, with the dogs and food, explains we call it associative conditioning. When two events repeatedly occur close together, they become fused or associated together in a person's mind, and explains a lot of familiar behaviors, both normal and abnormal. In abnormal, you've learned to associate the anticipation of something that really doesn't need to be there. We'll get into that later when we look at the different aspects of depression and anxiety and what have you. But to illustrate associative conditioning, aka classical or Pavlovian conditioning, I use my cats. When I first got 3 rescue kittens, I would have food ready for them, and they would smell the food, they would taste the food, and it was yummy. Their little bodies prepared to digest. They were salivating, eyes got bigger. They were just, all the bodily processes were preparing them for the ingestion of food. Yum. And then before I fed them, I had to open the can with a can opener. And you can see it was that hand one. It clicks a lot. And so until they associated with the sound of the can opener with the anticipation of food reward, the sound of the can opener didn't do anything. It's like, okay, why don't you feed me? But after a while, they would associate the food plus the sound of the can opener to the extent that sound of the can opener only would start the digestion food reward response. Excuse me. The fourth model is the cognitive model. This model proposes that we can best understand abnormal functioning by looking at cognitive processes. No, this is my cat. She heard that I was talking about food. So, argues that clinicians must ask questions about the client's assumptions of the universe they're in and their place in that universe, how they develop those assumptions, were they logical or illogical, their attitudes, and the thoughts that their client has. And you can see in this triad, cognitive model really espouses that thoughts create feelings, feelings create behavior, and behavior reinforces thoughts. So if the thoughts are faulty assumptions about the world the person lives in, then it's going to create distorted feelings, and the behavior will be a little bit stressful. So abnormal functioning can result from several kinds of cognitive problems: faulty assumptions and attitudes from the client, illogical thinking processes. And so Beck in the 60s, who developed cognitive therapy, looked at cognitive triad and errors in logic. And this illustration here shows you that. So a client can come in with negative views about the world and is running this internal message to himself or herself that everyone is against me because I'm worthless. And that leads to negative views about oneself. I'm worthless and inadequate, which leads to negative views about the future. I'll never be good at anything. And so cognitive therapists would say that's an illogical error in logic, and there's faulty assumptions. Let's find out where they came from and then change them. So cognitive therapy is pretty positive. Let's change it. Cognitive therapies can overcome their problems by developing new ways of thinking and the way they view the world. Beck's cognitive therapy and now the cognitive behavioral therapy. It's really helped. The goal is really to help clients recognize and restructure their thinking. It's used a lot in depression. And then 5, the humanistic therapy is one of the founders of that model was Carl Rogers in his client-centered therapy. And client-centered therapy are non-directive therapies and use active listening. Client-centered therapy is about self-righting tendencies. It's not that there's something wrong with the person. It's just that the person hasn't gotten in touch with their balance, their whole self. Carl Rogers in client-centered therapy would use unconditional positive regard, no judgment, and just let the client talk and find out the issues that are causing their distress on their own, which they do in some diagnoses. So he uses Rogers, or a therapist using client-centered therapy, would move towards self-actualization with their clients, have them understand free will, and show them unconditional positive regard. The other movement in humanistic therapy was by Fritz Perls, who developed Gestalt therapy and really encouraged clients to get in touch with their whole selves. Okay, so that's the gist of Chapter 3. Do read the chapters. A lot of great stuff in there that I just barely touched upon. And then, of course, read and study Chapter 4. And this week, we will be doing 6 different learning videos to help you internalize the principles of Chapter 3 and 4. And then we'll do a discussion based upon Chapters 3 and 4. And then, of course, a quiz to demonstrate that you pretty much know the major points of Chapters 3 and 4. Okay, that's it. Go to it. See you next time.